Good evening and welcome to the Redwood Library in Athenæum. I'm Patricia Pettit and I'm the Communications Officer here at the Redwood. We're delighted tonight to be welcoming Tim Shank for his lecture on deep ocean life and its promise for the future, the Northeast U.S. Submarine Canyons. Tim is a deep sea biologist. He's the associate scientist in the biology department and former director of the Ocean Exploration Institute at Woods Hole. He is known for his research on the ecology and evolution of deep sea creatures, including hydrothermal vents, seamounts, canyons, and deep trenches. He combines genetic approaches and ecological field studies to understand the conditions and adaptations that allow various species to migrate, evolve, and thrive into deep sea habitats. He's internationally recognized for his research on ocean floor community structure, the evolution of diverse deep sea species groups, many of which were previously undiscovered. He has pioneered the use of telepresence technology, making ocean exploration and research more accessible to the public. And he's conducted more than 60 scientific expeditions in the Arctic, the Atlantic, the Pacific, and the Indian Oceans. He's the author and co-author of more than 100 scientific papers and the award-winning best-selling book, Discovering the Deep. Tim has served on numerous scientific panels and national and international committees, leading to research, conservation, and management guidelines for deep sea ecosystems, oil spill response efforts, international initiatives, and setting international priorities for deep ocean exploration and research. I think we all have a lot to learn from him this evening, and it's certainly my pleasure to welcome you to the Redwood, Tim Shank. Welcome.
Thank you so much, Patricia, for that great introduction. I really appreciate it. Thank you so much for having me here. I'm thrilled to give a presentation tonight and just inform you about deep sea life and the canyons off our coast, the east coast of the United States. And so I have a presentation I want to give and then get to some questions and answers. Again, I'm thrilled to be here. Thank you so much for this opportunity. I'm going to share my screen and begin the presentation. And here it is. So, yes, I was challenged by coming up with a title because I normally talk about certain canyons in our off our coast here. 10 years ago, we knew canyons existed, but they were not mapped. They were not all named. They're just 100 miles off our coast. So it's like, for me, it's like driving to Boston on a bad day to get there. And so they're really in our own backyard. And so I have been in a race, if you will, to learn about life that's there, what's in the different canyons, learn more about them and share it with the public. So I think that we need to know to make some sound decisions about our management of these areas that are really fantastic. So let me get started. And to really introduce you to the canyons, I made an animation. So I just said we didn't have maps of these canyons 10 years ago. So when we did finally get topographic data of the seafloor 8 years ago, I made this animation actually using the actual data that we collected. We call it bathymetry data or topography. And you can see Cape Cod in the left-hand corner here. I'm just going to start it. It's sort of a fly through to show you how close the canyons are and just how extensive they are. Here we go. There's Long Island, Block Islands out there. Here we are under Provincetown now, looking at Stellwagen Bank. We're going to go under the water, across the shelf, over to the slope, to the deep sea, and you can see the massive drop-off miles down. And you can see these canyons, those dark areas cut to the bottom of the seafloor. As we back away here, you can see how many they are. Now, these were created over 20,000 years ago when sea level was much lower than it is now. And these are rivers that cut through the slope to make these canyons form. Here you also see seamounts. This is now the abyssal plain of our Atlantic Ocean. There's seamounts that extend off of New England all the way halfway across the ocean, the Atlantic. So you can see from Canada all the way down to North Carolina, we have more than 90 canyons, right? I just named a few there off our coast. And so we're just learning about them now. And we engaged in studies in 2012 for the first time in these canyons. And we systematically explored them with different vehicles, mostly with a towed camera system I'll talk about later. We tow it from the back of a ship. But these things in yellow, you can see, these are the major canyons that we've identified. The triangles over here are actually seamounts, and you can see how close they are to the U.S. East Coast. They're inside the exclusive economic zone of the United States. They are actually our property. They are heritage. They're our national park system, if you will. They belong to us. And so it's up to us to manage them and know what's there. And so I want to give you a sense of just how close they really are. Here's 3 northeast canyons, major canyons, and I call them major because they cut into the continental slope. We also call them incised canyons. But here's a topographic map of 3 major canyons here called Oceanographer, Gilbert, and Ladonia. And we have visited these canyons before, not like Ladonia we just did for the first time 2 years ago with just a couple of dives in a submarine. But I want to give you a sense of the topography. This is most important to understand about these canyons, that how big they are. You can see, first of all, I put the depth of the Grand Canyon here. It's 1.3 miles down, right? So that's this depth, wherever you see this green right here. That's 1.3 miles down. So they go much deeper than that. I could fit the Grand Canyon in the majority of the canyons that we have off our coast. They're immense. And so it's not easy to study them when they're in the deep sea. We have to get access to them and get vehicles in the water and go down. It's like shining a flashlight, somewhere in the desert, and try to see what you can find. It's not easy. But anyway, I want to give you a sense of this topography because this is what makes the canyon so special. So the currents go from right to left off our coast, and they do so about the depth here of the darker blue. And they come along from right to left, and they hit these massive walls, vertical walls, big structures, promontories, and they get diverted upward. And they're bringing a lot of cold water and nutrients up into the canyons. It's called upwelling. And it happens with all these canyons. And it's really complex topography, such that these currents swirl around, and they go up and they go down, they go sideways. It's really sort of chaotic. And that's what brings nutrients into these canyons, and the canyons funnel those nutrients up to the surface. And so that's huge. That is defining how these canyons in and of themselves and their productivity. If we just look at some of the surveys that the New England Aquarium has done in that group, they really identify these canyons as hotspots of biological diversity and abundance. If you look here, you can see Cape Cod on the left, and you see this red ridge here. That's the top of the canyons, right? And you see this little black line is actually our exclusive economic zone, right? So that's the edge of our country, okay? So you can see these hotspots where they observe all these whales and dolphin and porpoise and sharks. So on a single day with an airplane, they go and survey for a single day, they can find 60 Rizzo's dolphins, 50 humpback whales, 80 bottlenose dolphins, and they're all gathered around the top of these top of these canyons, excuse me. And so that's where we're seeing a lot of our commercial fish aggregate too. That's where our recreational fishermen go out to fish at the top of these canyons. And so these canyons are hotspots. It's amazing that they have more than 13 species of whales, more than 10 species of dolphin, I think more than 12 species of shark. It's really amazing. And it's not just the surface that's so productive. It's all the way throughout the water column. And some of these whales, the deepest diving whales on the planet, dive in these canyons down to 1,200 meters and beyond, right? So over a mile down. And so when you do go to the bottom and look, you see things like this. And, let me get rid of this so you can see the pictures better. My apologies. Let me just hide this for a second and come back. There we go. So this is a promontory. This is a canyon, a northeast canyon. You can see here, this is all hard bottom because the currents come by and whip all the sediment off of it. And then colonies of corals and sponges grow. And they love being on these outer edges. And I'll explain that in just a second. Here's another example of a big forest here of what we call bubblegum coral. These are 5 feet in height, and they extend off the walls of these canyons. It's really amazing. And I think what will help is I'm just going to show some video of what we find, because we find corals and sponges in great abundance. I'm going to take you on just a quick, 1 or 2 minute dive here to show you what it's like. So here's a promontory. There's over 21 species of coral here: hard coral, soft coral, different kinds of corals. They get onto the morphology and into the cracks of the rock. There's these kinds of soft corals. You see they have these long arms with tentacles on them that they use to feed. And they just colonize large areas of the seafloor. Here's an entire wall covered in stony corals, hard corals. And you see they create these places where octopus live, like little caves. There's crabs and there's fish, and they aggregate around these places. And I'll show you that again. Here's a bubblegum coral, like a tree extending off the rock into the water column. And then you see, when you get close up, you see massive amounts of shrimp on them, thriving on that coral, and only that coral. Fish love these corals. They use them, they lay eggs in these corals. Certain corals, they also get behind the current, out of the current, and they feed around these corals, because these corals attract so many invertebrate species of life. And so they're all sorts of colors, all sorts of morphologies. A survey we did in 2015 had us discover 37 new species of corals, and we didn't begin to tap into what's really there. Here you look close up at one of these corals, you see the tentacles extended. I'll talk about that in a second, but you see shrimp there living on them. Corals live around places where methane's coming out of the seafloor. There's hydrocarbon seeps at the base of these canyons. Here's one here covered with mussels and gastropods and other animals with methane all around coming out. These are specialized animals that only live at these seep areas in these canyons. So I wanted to give you just a brief, I think videos, gives you 1,000 words for a frame. Anyway, because deep sea corals dominate these canyons in terms of diversity and biomass, I want to tell you more about them. They really are the dominant player here, because they form habitats for other animals. So they are diverse, they're complex, and we know little about them, like how they reproduce, how they grow. We really don't know that much. There's a concerted scientific community right now. There's hundreds of us out there trying to understand, just focus on corals. But these corals don't have the plant symbiont, the algae, that you see in Caribbean reefs. If you go to a silica coral in the Caribbean, you'll see that they have they are in the photic zone, they're in the sunlight. You've seen this before, and you've probably heard about bleaching, where that symbiont, the algae, leaves the coral, and the coral really can't survive, and it's called a bleach, and it dies. These corals don't have that symbiosis. They don't have that algae. Instead, they have polyps. I think you saw some of those. They are polyps that extend off of branches that actually feed. Their tentacles surrounded by a mouth, and they rely on passive particles to come by. That's why they love the canyons. They extend out into the water column, and they get the passing nutrients. So what I want you to understand, what's key here, is that a few things. They're very slow growing. And I'll tell you how slow in just a second, but it's simply amazing how slow they grow and how old they are. And we really don't ever see them colonizing. We don't know why that is. We don't see patches of young. You see like the adults, like you see here, these colonies are all adults. So we don't know how fast they will recruit. So if there were something to come along and knock out a population of these things, or a canyon goes extinct somehow or something, there's a major catastrophe, we don't think they're going to be able to colonize or come back anytime soon. We're talking that it will be centuries. What's really the focus of my lab and what we do here is look at the diverse animal communities that live on the corals. The corals provide a habitat structure like trees do for birds and other animals, squirrels. These corals do that. There's more than 3,500 species. There's probably closer to 10,000 species that live on deep water corals. We just have yet to describe them all. But with these issues, I want you to know they're very vulnerable to fisheries activities and mining, oil and gas extraction. And we've already seen that. A lot of the work that I started with in 2010 was in response to the Gulf oil spill in the Gulf of Mexico. We were out there studying deep water corals, doing the same kind of surveys we were doing in the canyons here when the spill happened. And they called us out, and we indeed came across at depth, a mile down, the same level as the plume where it came out of the spill. We saw lots of dead corals, and we did a lot of work there to understand how they died. And that was part of the reason why we started focusing on the Atlantic canyons, because there were oil companies that already were leasing plots in the canyons. and without us even knowing what lived there. And so we've been in a race to try to inform government and policy decision makers about what's out there. So let me continue on just to give you a little bit more about the corals. There's three major types of corals. There's hard corals or stony corals. That's what you see here in the white. That means the skeleton's on the outside and the flesh is on the inside. So you see there's a lot of these white things. That's a calcareous skeleton. And just at the tip here, you see the polyp. That's the fleshy bit. The arms come out and then the mouth is in the middle. Right? And then you have soft corals, which is just the reverse. They're more like us. We have a skeleton on the inside and tissue on the outside. So here you see the skeleton, a thin veneer of skin is around that skeleton. And then here you see all the polyps. If you count, there's 8 tentacles here. That's why they're called octocorals. And there's a mouth in the middle, and they'll just sit open passively. And then when nutrients come in, particles come in, they'll grab them and eat them. And then, So then the other type is a black coral. And that's what's pictured here. Now, black corals don't have that ring of 8 tentacles. They have 6 tentacles per mouth. And those 6 tentacles are all linear along a branch. So this is the trunk of the coral here in the center. And then you have these branches that come off. So there'll be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and then a mouth. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and a mouth. That kind of thing. And you're probably saying, Tim, that's not a black coral. That's an orange coral. And you're right. Black corals actually can be yellow, white, red, all colors, purple. The blackness of the coral refers to the skeleton. If you look beyond the thin veneer of skin on the surface here, that's a black skeleton. And a lot of places like off Hawaii, they collect black corals for jewelry. And so that's a big industry. It's also been decimating corals in the Pacific. So with that, I also want to remind you of the point that I made before, is that deep sea corals are really slow growing. Here's a coral that's about 3 feet tall. It's in about 500 meters of water, so a quarter of a mile down or so. It's a black coral. And as you can see, the black skeleton at the bottom here. I usually have the audience try to guess how old this might be at being about 3 feet tall, but we collected this and radiocarbon dated it, and it's over 4,000 years old. So it's growing microns per year. This is the longest living animals in the ocean, are these deep water corals. So something as big as your hand could be 300 years old, 500 years old. Again, they're also can be very brittle. So if you hit them, they'll fall down. They can't eat. Animals won't live on them if they die. So, it's a real problem. So they're very vulnerable. These deep water corals. The other thing I want you to know about these corals is that they have these amazing partnerships with other life forms. I've told you they're habitat forming. Here you can see a brittle star with its 5 arms extended into this soft coral, wrapped around the soft coral. It may be there for life. It may grow with that coral and be there for life and re-wrapped around. Oftentimes when I sample these and bring them up, these arms are so rigid around it. It's been there for decades. And this is also an anemone here that specializes in living on these corals. And what's really fantastic is that here you see several different kinds of corals, right? On the left side, you see one coral, this yellow one in the middle. There's that hard coral again on the bottom here, and then another soft coral here on the far right. They each have a brittle star on them, but they're different species of brittle star. So what we're seeing is that each coral has co-evolved with an animal or 2 or 3 in a very specific way. So the only place we see this brittle star here on this white coral is on that white coral. So somehow it has to find that white coral in this deep abyss of trying to find its host. We don't know how it happens. We don't know at all how long these brittle stars live, for example. Crabs do the same thing. Here's a crab on a beautiful octocoral. You can see the tentacles again, which I love. Here's an anemone back here, but this guy will live here too for its life. We don't see them all out off these corals. And we think that they're feeding on animals that may swim by, right? And what's beautiful is that the hooks on the tips of the legs are specially almost built to be wrapped around the size of the branches of the coral. So they're morphologically adapted to be there. Here's another example, another crab sitting in an octocoral that will spend its life there. It's simply astounding. And here's one of the ones I love here from the canyons and the seamounts off our coast is that here's a black coral, like a bottle brush coral, 2 feet long, and it's got these size of a quarter crabs on them. And often when we sample them and look at them, there'll be 3 crabs here, a male and a female, and then often a juvenile that'll live like a family unit on this bottle brush black coral. It's the only place that species lives. It's astounding, right? It's in terms of evolutionary biologists like me, it's an unbelievable system to try to understand how life has evolved to be this way. And I have so many examples. I don't want to go on too long, but here's a coral here that has a lot of brittle stars on it. But if you magnify a branch, here's individual polyps. They're pulled in right now. There are little polychaete worms, little worms that live inside the skin of the coral. In fact, when this worm lands on the coral makes a new sheath. It makes a house for the polychaete to live in, the worm. And if in this picture, there may be more than 300 of these worms. I mean, they are so co-adapted, co-evolved, it's amazing. So also these corals, I got to say, serve as habitat, not only for animals that just live on them, but also things like fish. Fish use them as nurseries, as refuges. It's amazing. They are integral to commercial species of fish, period. They lay their eggs in here. They grow up around these corals. We'll see juveniles in and outside the corals, harboring shelter and whatnot. One of the things I discovered here also a few years ago was you see this orange coral with its little polyps, very small, and you see this golf ball size thing here. It's brown and it's cracked open here. Well, this is the first and only time we witnessed the birth of a deep sea octopus. We had no idea about the life history of octopus at this stage. It turns out that the female octopus, the ones like Dumbo that have these large fins to the side, they have about 3,000 to 4,000 eggs, and they lay them on very specific corals. We think they're there for about 10 months or so. We don't really know. It's like I said, the only one we found. We did an MRI on this individual here and learned all about its brain structure. It has yolk. When it comes out of that egg, it is fully ready to be an octopus and go live. But it does have yolk reserves. And I want to show you, there's the egg under a microscope. You can see that, but I want to show you this. Oh, this video is not going to play. Never mind. It was coming out of the shell there. I apologize for that. It's not working. But it was the first time. It swam around for 10 minutes into the jar. I put it in, and then it passed away. But we've learned so much from that. And we've seen these eggs other places. Here's a purple egg that's been attached by an octopus here. It looks like it's about ready to come out and crack open too. But we also see cat sharks lay their eggs and fish lay their eggs. Here's an example here just from last month. Here's another octocoral. There's a brittle star on it. There's an egg mass, an egg mass for fish laying there, and there's an octopus egg there. So these are integral in the life histories of different species. Corals are so important. As they are so important, they're also so vulnerable, and they face many, many threats. And I think ocean warming is one of the principal ones that we're seeing now. In fact, because I'm talking about the New England canyons and Northeast canyons, this area, by all the modelists, the climate modelers say that this area is going to heat up more faster than any other place in the Atlantic. And here's a heat map showing that a seafloor anomaly of temperature, and so here's the Gulf of Maine. This is going to be so hot. This is a great place for us to study and learn about how these species react to temperature. Corals are very sensitive to temperature. There's some that create reefs in the Gulf of Mexico that if they go above 13 degrees C, they will die, period, and don't recover. We got issues like acidification. That's just, pH is going down, CO2 is going up. We also have issues of extractive industries like fishing. Here you see on the far right here, this is all hard coral in this net that was brought up in one day on a fishing vessel. And you can see, I told you how long it takes him to grow, 4,000 years for every 3 feet, right? So, this is a lot of corals. This is thousands of years here, right? If not tens of thousands of years. We saw the oil issues with the oil spill in the Gulf of Mexico. I want to show you an example of a coral colony and brittle stars that were impacted by the Deepwater Horizon oil spill. You can see the coral is just almost dead, completely dead. And these brittle stars here are turning colors, and they're not feeding well. They're not well positioned on the coral, not wrapped around. Major problems. And here we often see nets from fishing activity. We see fish pots, lobster pots, and also lots of debris on the seafloor. I think every canyon, and we've looked at, 40 canyons now with a towed camera system, we've seen trash in every canyon. we worry most about plastic bags because those plastic bags can wrap around a coral and then the polyps can't feed. So that's of serious concern. And so we're working on some writing up all the work from that work on debris in the canyons. So a lot of issues. And so that's why we presented a lot of data and these issues to policymakers in the Obama administration. And that administration in September of 2016, created the Northeast Canyons and Seamounts Marine National Monument. It includes three canyons, like the ones I showed you in that topographic map. That's the same ones right here, that little box, and also 4 seamounts that also host corals. It's actually pretty small. It's about the size of Connecticut. It's 13 times smaller than the smallest monument in the Pacific, but it creates an opportunity for scientists like myself to see places that are unimpacted by human activity, ongoing human activity. So we really have been in favor of that. We could talk about that more if you like. So anyway, that's been created by the Obama administration. It was rescinded by the Trump administration, and now the Biden administration just less than 2 months ago reinstated it. So it's really it's a no-take zone, more or less, for fisheries activities. I want to tell you a little bit about how we do our work. So this is open ocean work. So we use things like the research vessel Neil Armstrong, that's operated by the Woodsville Oceanographic Institution. And many of the things I'm going to talk about, I've been talking about, were discovered by using a towed camera system. We do have submarines, we have robots, autonomous vehicles at our disposal, but for the money, for the taxpayer, this gives a lot of good results quickly and easily. We can survey a lot of area in canyons relatively quickly. This thing it's a towed sled, more or less. So it's connected by a tether to the ship, and it sends up images that we can look at in real time and see what's on the seafloor. It gives us a lot of data like temperature, depth, conductivity. It can take samples of the water. It can also take samples of the sediment. So anyway, I won't go too much in that, but we tow that behind the ship up the sides of these canyons and learn what we can. So here's a map just of some of the MidAtlantic canyons. And I wanted to make this point that some of these canyons are really large, like Ryan Canyon up here, versus ones like Spencer or Linden Canyon or Carteret. And when we first mapped this in 2012, we said, wow, this is a big difference between this canyon and this canyon. In terms of Ryan, for example, in sizes, it cuts through the continental shelf. Maybe that means there's more energy of currents being able to go up and go down. It reaches further up into the shallow areas where other species may come in and interact. The downwelling or the drift of material from the water column, from the surface to depth, maybe more there. So we sort of separated incised canyons from non-incised canyons, major canyons from minor canyons. You see a slew of minor canyons in here, right? And so we've been investigating those as well to see if they're different from the major canyons. But I just want to introduce that concept to you because that's the framework that the scientists are using right now to try to understand the canyon dynamics. Here's a close-up showing you more of this. Here's Wilmington Canyon that cuts into the shelf. Look at all these ones that don't, right? How important are these for corals and animal species? You have Baltimore Canyon, right? And Washington Canyon, they're really massive canyons. Are these the ones that are hosting the most diversity, the big canyons? And do they then sort of, when the animals release their larvae to the water column, the corals and other things, do they go to other canyons or not? Are they confined to these big canyons? These are the kind of questions that we have. Here's just an example of imagery we get from this towed vehicle system. Here you're looking down the slope of a vertical wall here. Lots of little stony corals here, hard corals here, soft corals are here. You see octopus here. This camera's looking down to give you some perspective. Here's large, it's a black coral here on the bottom right. So this is what we use to go then and conduct our surveys and collect our data. Here's Linden Canyon, for example, all these skates. There's hundreds of skates here on the side. We don't know why they aggregate in that canyon, but that's important for us to know, right? It's all part of the ecosystem that's down there. Now, I'm going to show you a little bit of data. It's not going to be heavy lifting, but on the left-hand side here, it's depth. Okay, and think of 1,200 meters here. There's 500, 800, 1,200. That's a mile down for reference. Okay, that 1,200 meters a mile down. And this represents one canyon. This sort of guitar string or thing that I'm showing here is individual species types. There's 13 types of coral we're looking at. Each type has its own string in this guitar, neck, if you will. So you can see here that the Bathypathes, the black coral here, that's a black coral. It's here, here, and here in Wilmington Canyon at the depth of a little over a mile. Okay, I hope that's clear. And sea pens that love sediment habitat. They're all down here at this depth, right? So, for example, I just wanted to get that straight because I'm going to show you a comparison to 6 other canyons. This is kind of the work we do. We want to compare the canyons. Are they the same? Are they different? Are the big ones different than the little ones? And so you can already see here that there are major differences in the canyons, right? Even at the same depths, right? We see less abundance here in Carteret than we do over here in Spencer at the same depth, right? The black corals here love Spencer and they love Wilmington. And this now shows you the depth range of the survey that we did. So in some surveys we did with the camera, we saw no corals at all, especially when in the shallow areas, very little. Right? But when we get into this zone here of 1,200, 800 to 1,200 to 1,400, really diverse coral ecosystems and abundant ecosystems. So I just want to give you a flavor of how we look at things. And then we can go now and then say, hey, okay, let's look at the ones that don't incise the shelf, don't cut in, versus the ones that incise. And it's pretty immediate that the ones that incise the shelf have much more productivity, much more diversity, much more abundance than those that don't incise the shelf. And so this is not even getting to what new species are there or not. These are just the categorical species that we have, black coral, hard coral, and that kind of thing. So then we present this data then. Oh, I'm sorry. Let me do one more thing. We also look at the habitat that they're in, that the corals are settled on, whether they're on boulders, whether they live on coral rubble, whether the tops of the walls, whether they're on outcrops, whether they're on vertical walls. And I think you can see here, right? So here are the different habitat types as guitar strings. You can see that the vertical walls have massive amount of diversity and abundance in the top of the wall. So it's the walls that really give us the diversity, right? That's the walls we may want to consider protecting in some way or doing more studies on, right? And so I think that's super important for them to understand, that policymakers to understand, so we can make really good decisions. And so we've given data like this to the different management councils, the fisheries management councils, and there's one in the Northeast, there's one in the Mid-Atlantic. You can see they're separated here in their jurisdiction. We gave these data and worked with the fishing industry, commercial fishermen, and as individuals and policymakers. And after many meetings, which was a great collaboration, we ended up with this protected area. This that you see hatched here in red is the largest marine protected area in North America. It was done a couple of years ago. And now we provide the same kind of data, information, imagery, extensive reports about the Northeast canyons as well, and the Seamounts. And they're currently thinking about how they're going to manage these areas, considering the shelf and slope and all that kind of thing. So that's the utility of the data that we're generating here. And I'm gonna stop here because I actually want to answer questions and have interactions with you guys. So thank you again for the opportunity. I'm glad to share what I could share.
Well, Tim, thank you so much. That was absolutely fascinating. I think maybe Julia's going to want to take your PowerPoint down so we can see you when we're answering questions. Great. If you could end it.
I'll do that.
There we go. There we go. Fascinating. And I have to tell you, we have a really large audience today. And I don't know if she's on tonight, but I'd really like to give a thank you to one of our wonderfully active board members, Elizabeth Leatherman, who very kindly arranged for this lecture tonight. So Elizabeth, if you're there, thank you so much, because this is giving us such a wonderfully diverse presentation. And we've got some questions. So let's get started, Tim.
Great.
The first one is, Looking forward to the lecture. Maybe location of German sub off Block Island.
So there are canyons. There's a canyon called Block Canyon, actually, that's off of Block Island. And there has been some, I'll say, chatter this year about a submarine that was perhaps detected, I think, southeast of Block Island. I've been approached with what we know about that region biologically and geologically. I haven't heard any more than that. I haven't. I've submitted a lot of information, and I think there may be a interest in having an expedition to go investigate whether that submarine is there or not.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Here's a question from Dennis Stockerty, and he wants to know, how much fishing gear do you encounter when exploring the canyons? Block, Hudson, VTech, hydrograph, oceanographer, Leonia, Munson.
So I mentioned that we see human-derived debris in every canyon. You can't avoid it, whether it's magazines or whether it's plastic containers, bottles, aluminum cans. But there is a notable amount of fishing gear, and that comes in the form of large nets, lines. It's a lot of long lining for deep water fish species. And so we see a lot of spooled wire, a lot of fishing wire, which is really dangerous for us operating vehicles, because if our propellers get stuck in that or that kind of thing, it'll be a real problem. But we see metal still. I've seen aircraft engines. I've seen toilets. I've seen showers, paint cans. Anything that's on a ship can end up on the seafloor. And so I would say that about 80% of what we see there is fishing gear. And again, that's fish pots, big 6 foot by 6 foot fishing pots, and lobster pots, and spooled gear. The concern that we often have is that those pots have bait in them, or the animals will go in and become bait, right? And so it'll be a trap, or it'll be a trap for eternity. It'll keep collecting animals. Animals walk in, they die, more come in and eat them. It's gonna, so we have a real issue. If we have a vehicle out there, a robot that we're tethered with and can use with a manipulator arm, we will destroy the cage, the pot, if we can, so they won't keep collecting animals.
Mm-hmm. Another question we have: why do we need a Northeast Canyon and Seamounts Marine National Monument?
Well, that's another great question, and it was highly debated, and I think that it became more and more, to my mind, overwhelming. I'm really am someone who is not making policy. I'm someone who informs policymakers. That's first and foremost. I feel like any place that we can have a protected area from human disturbance, we can look at the natural changes in our ocean and in life. So when the Northeast starts to heat up, like it's going to in the coming decades, we have a baseline that we can follow, a natural baseline we can follow and watch, and make measurements and make predictions and construct models. If we don't have that natural progression that we can observe, then we don't have a chance of predicting anything. And so it's really favorable for us and highly advantageous for us to have an area set aside like this. And it's actually a very small area. And I can talk more about that if you want to, because I know where the corals are now, and I know where the fishermen fish, and they really don't overlap very much. Mm-hmm. So hope that answers.
Well, here's a different one. Do you know anything about the submarine, the USS Connecticut, crashing into a mountain?
Yes, I do. That crashed into a deep water seamount. I think it was going at a really good clip, close to 20 knots. It was going over an area of seafloor that wasn't mapped or mapped well. And so that was I think that there were 112 people injured, a couple of fatalities. But the lesson that came out of that was the fact that we don't know our deep ocean very well. We shouldn't be, being in those areas that really are unmapped. And so now there's a real concerted effort to map the full ocean by 2030. I'm not sure if it can be done, but it's surprising to me. And I was really shocked in 2010, 2011, to know that part of our country underwater wasn't mapped. Over half of the United States is underwater. I don't think people realize that. And to not have it mapped is just remarkable. I just assumed it was already done. And so there are groups of people now that are, it's their fundamental goal to go and finish mapping our own EEZ by 2030.
Mm-hmm. Wow. Now this is a really tough one. What is your favorite sea animal?
It is absolutely impossible. I mean, just say, I mean, I've been on, I don't know, 70.
Who's your favorite child?
I don't know. I mean, here's one next to me that I think is really remarkable. This is a single animal. You can see it. It's a brittle star, lives on a coral. It's massive. I mean, you can see my hand, right? The thing is huge. It's called a basket star, and it lives on a single coral species. You know, that, and then here's a crab species that lives on a coral. I don't know if you can see that. Look at all the spines. Can you see it? I don't know if you can see it very well. Mm-hmm. But so these are all, to me, just evolutionary perfections. I can show you a deep sea crab that's also massive. This crab lives only on hydrothermal vent chimneys. These are the geysers on the seafloor that form these polymetallic chimneys that can be 60 feet tall. And this crab, the water coming out of that chimney is 750 degrees Fahrenheit, super hot, unbelievably hot. And these crabs live on the side of that active chimney. It's really amazing. I think my favorite, though, is the hydrothermal vent tube worm called Riftia. It's a giant tube worm. It can be 10 feet long. It has no mouth, no gut, no digestive system at all. It is a gill at the top where water goes in with nutrients. And it has 3 types of hemoglobin. It's evolved a new type of hemoglobin to bring those nutrients down. The nutrients are toxic to us. If you and me have that hydrogen sulfide that it has to live in around, we would die in under a minute, right? It's like rotten eggs. Anyway, it brings the nutrients down the body to a bag of bacteria. And that bag of bacteria has many millions of bacteria into it, and it converts those toxic nutrients, if you will, into carbon that the animal can grow. And that tube worm can grow. It's one of the fastest growing marine invertebrates on Earth, if not the fastest. So, and it lives in the cold, dark, deep sea, and it's got all these novel adaptations to living in this really hostile environment. Wow. So that's my long-winded answer.
Well, sorry. You narrowed it down at least.
They're all fantastic. That's hard to choose one. It's like choosing a child over a mother. You can't do that.
It is. It is. Yeah. Here's another one. And by the way, if anybody wants to ask a question, there's a little ask a question down at the bottom in the middle of your screen. And you can also type it in to say something nice on the right-hand side. But here's another question. You mentioned that the sea was much lower in the past, which allowed the canyons to form. When was that? And would a 4,000-year-old coral have been around then?
So coral being 4,000 years, the sea level was about 18,000 years ago when it was low. So there's a lot of ice in the Arctic and on Earth. And as it's been melting since the last glacial period, it's been rising. And so these areas were exposed, if you will, during that low sea level stand. And it wasn't just that the rivers were cutting these canyons and making them happen. There was a lot of other earth and materials that were being pushed down. So if you go to the bottom of the canyons, you'll see a lumpy mess of where things fell down 18,000 years ago. So 4,000-year-old coral would not have seen that. But then again, we haven't seen all the corals, so we don't know if there is one that could be 18,000 years old. Interesting.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Here's another one. You talked mostly about the canyons. What about the seamounts? What's happening there?
So seamounts are fascinating. They're formed volcanically. So in the middle of the ocean, there'll be a hot spot. There'll be a part of our mantle underneath the seafloor. And that mantle, every once in a while, will erupt out of the seafloor, and it will build up rock and to form a mountain, like a volcano underwater is what it is. And then the plate, the oceanic plate will move. The plates on Earth are moving around. right? So the plate will move, and then there'll be another eruption, and it'll form another seamount. So seamounts will be side by side, right? It'll make another one. So that's why we have chains of seamounts all over the world. Off New Zealand, we have the Louisville Seamount Chain, which has dozens of these volcanic mountains or seamounts. Off of New England, we have a line or a chain of seamounts that extends all the way to the Mid-Atlantic Ridge, the middle of the Atlantic, and it goes all the way up into New York. The hills of New York are old seamounts, and so they don't. So as the plate moves, they don't stay volcanically active, right? They go dormant, and then they move, and then they are just hard bottom structure, like the canyons are hard bottom structures that corals and sponges love. Right, these corals, as you see, they're sessile. They don't move. They land on the bottom and they stay there. And so they want hard bottom. And so seamounts are beautiful for that. Currents are whipping by seamounts all the time. They form eddies all the time. And it's been a critical part of the theory of life in the deep ocean that seamounts may be things that cause new species to form. And what I mean by that is that seamounts are such that currents go by them, and then when they go by them, they form eddies, and the eddies are like a vortex rotating around the seamount. And any larvae from anything, so let's say a crab releases an egg, and the egg hatches and it goes into a larval form. It tries to get out of that seamount and go somewhere else. It can't. It stays at that seamount, and so you can't leave. So you have to evolve that whole seamount in situ on its own. So it becomes an evolutionary sort of hotspot of endemism, kind of thing. It's all species you don't see anywhere else. They only are found there, right? So seamounts are fascinating in and of themselves, and so the ones that we have on the New England Seamount chain that go up to New York, there's 4 of them that are inside our EEZ, and because they are super important for productivity, having corals, having commercial fish around them, they've been fished. Our seamounts have been fished by the Russians, the Spanish, the English, over the last 2 centuries. And so they wanted to conserve those as well, or manage those well, and watch them, and just like they're doing the canyons. We want to know now what species are shared with the canyons and the seamounts. Do the canyons serve as stepping stones for dispersal of animals? So one group of crabs, let's say shrimp or whatever, in one canyon releases its eggs and larvae, and it goes to the next canyon, and then that group now that's in that canyon goes to the next canyon, then it goes to the seamount. So they're stepping stones of dispersal that if you didn't have them, you'd have to be stuck in the same canyon or stuck in the same seamount to evolve. I hope that makes some sense. Mm-hmm. So the seamounts that are inside the monument are just like the canyons in terms of their high priority to understand productivity, biodiversity, and abundance, and also what supports our commercial fish industry.
Mm-hmm. David Voorhees has a question. Did Darwin do us a disservice by telling us about the survival of the fittest? Your photos make me think that coevolution has been more important than competition. What are your thoughts?
Wow.
It's just a very simple question.
What a great question. I've never been asked that question, but it's fascinating. Right. So clearly Darwin's theory, right? Natural selection is what has led us to ask questions about coevolution. That's one way of looking at it, right? It's along the scientific narrative of storyline, if you will, the narrative story had to go through Darwin for us to get here. Now, coevolution doesn't mean it's not survival of the fittest. I think that we have seen in the genetic work that I do in my lab, I work on DNA of these animals. We've seen the evolution of corals go down with depth. So over evolutionary time, they have colonized deeper and deeper, right? And so at the same time, we know that the partnerships, the fidelity of those partnerships, meaning one animal has to be on that one host coral, right? They're partners for life. That's the only one they can be. We see that specificity as we go deeper and deeper. As we go shallow, we get more and more, sort of loose associations of partnerships. So there's something about depth and how they've evolved to go deep that's also at play here, that you'll be the fittest if you're the brittle star that can find the coral that just is evolving to come down in depth, if that makes sense. It's a great question. I think that the evolution at some level is based on selection pressure, right? The pressure to live somewhere and make a living, and genetic mutations. So there's certain places corals can't go, like up into the Arctic or whatever, or certain places that it's too deep. We don't see corals beyond 6,100 meters. And so they have to, I mean, the one we did find there had no associates on it at all, no partners on it at all. So it's a great question. I'm going to have to scratch my head more about it. I think that's pretty neat. But I think that we've rooted all of our discussions and thoughts and theories on Darwin's principles. There's no doubt about that. But I think coevolution may be more important than we think. And I think that convergent evolution, meaning the corals take the shape of trees and trees have taken the shape of trees, they have converged on a morphology of branches and leaves and polyps that is also really interesting. And so I'm not sure how Darwin would have solved convergent evolution, but that's coming more and more as we do these studies. Great question. Thank you.
And here's two about, do you find the same types of coral on the seamounts?
Yes. That was our first order question, right? When we started studying the canyons, we want to know, is it the same species? And the answer was yes, we do see the similar species.
And do you see that corals that are endemic to particular canyons?
Yes. And so when we started looking at the first canyons in 2012, we started seeing that each canyon had its own set of species, its own unique group, if you will. There were a couple of species that were, I'll say, cosmopolitan to the canyons, meaning they were in every canyon. Okay. But there were much more, there were different species in different canyons. And that's still holding true. But depth is becoming a factor. As we do more surveys at different depths, we try to do a shallow depth at 500 meters, and then one at 1,000 to 1,200, and then one deep at 1,800 meters, just try to see what the difference might be off the bat. And so we are starting to see, we continue to see lots of differences between canyons, but we also see similarities. That's not a cop-out. It's just, I think that they are, what we need to do next is go sample the corals that we've been observing and look at their genetics, their DNA, and their DNA will tell us if they are the same or not, if they're just really closely related species that are slightly different, if they're starting to differentiate more and more because the canyons are getting older and older. We need to go back. We need to go now and sample those a certain number of corals in each of those canyons to answer that kind of question. Mm-hmm. That was the first order question that we had to do. So
there you go. Now here's one about the QE2 from Trip Allen. The ocean liner QE2 struck a submerged obstacle approximately 20 to 25 years ago, south of the Elizabeth Islands. Was this a seamount?
I think not. The shallowest that the seamounts come in this part of the Atlantic is 800 meters, right? So 2,400 feet. So I would be hard pressed to say we had something that shallow on this side of the Atlantic.
All right. If there's any other questions out there, just send them along. I think, Tim, this has been a fascinating discussion. And I just want to remind everyone, because there was so much information there to digest, that you can see it again. I'd like to review it. You can see it again on Crowdcast directly after this is concluded, and then by tomorrow it will be up on our YouTube channel. So either way, if you want to go back and take a peek, because it was a lot of good information.
And I don't know whether to apologize for that, because I am certainly enthusiastic about this. I get excited about it. I tend to speak quickly, but I also really wanted to get to the question and answers and the interactions, because that's
Yeah,
where
sure.
I also learn a lot of things about what people are thinking, you know. So every year I take this data and do congressional briefings and talk to national leagues and whatnot, so they understand what we're doing and what the importance is. You know, there are certainly there's lots. So in 2012 we did the first topographic mapping, right, to get the maps you saw.
Mhm.
And along with that mapping, there's data that comes with that tells us something about the water column. In fact, it can tell us where methane is bubbling out of the seafloor. Right, so that's where methane bubbles out of the seafloor. There's unique animal systems that live there, ecosystems that live there, and it's indicative that there may be a lot of oil and gas for extracting. So when they did those surveys, mapping surveys in 2012, 2013, they found over 500 plumes of methane coming up, right, in these canyons, where previously we only knew of 2, right? So there's groups that have been trying to go out there and assess where these massive hydrocarbon seeps, they're called, which can have dozens of species that are different too than anywhere else in the world, and have corals around them as well. So, you know, I just wanted to let people know that there's a, you know, there was a push for a while for governors to open up access to the deep sea off their coast. The Obama administration said no, moratorium for now. It was just after the big spill. And so there's no guarantee that it won't be opened up or whatever. So I'm letting people know that there likely are oil and gas. There are leases that have already been given out. And even though it's pretty deep where they are accessible. The Deepwater Horizon was at 1,200 meters, and that was one of the deeper ones. That's why it's called the Deepwater Horizon. And now that's like commonplace. They've gone deeper than that in the Gulf of Mexico. So in the last 10 years, that technology has advanced to go deeper. So there is a bit of a race if that's going to happen for us to inform people that what's out there and what's important.
Well, as one of our audience members just commented, this was awesome, and that it was also wonderful to have your enthusiastic presentation, and I couldn't agree more. So I think, Tim, we have to make an arrangement to have you back again in the spring to continue this conversation, and we'd be thrilled to have you back if you're willing.
I would love that. I'd be happy to come back anytime.
Terrific.
I have many more projects.
Thank you so much.
So thank you for having me. I really appreciate it. It was a lot of fun.
Terrific. Thanks loads. And we're going to take a real turn next week for our next lecture. And it's going to be with Howard Newman, who perhaps some of you know here. He's a Newporter. And he was approached a few years ago by Yale University to design and actually fabricate a mace, a professional scepter, for the Yale Faculty of Arts and Sciences. And it's a beautiful piece. It's been on display the last few weeks at the Redwood, and I hope most of you have seen it. It was really extraordinary. He's going to join us next week to tell us about the whole process and the fabrication and what all the symbols mean and so forth. I think it will be an interesting time. So do visit the website as always and register. And thank you for joining us tonight. Good night.